Hello, Charles. Hello, everybody. Many thanks for having me here and for the invitation to speak to you about all change after Merkel question mark. Um, what I'm going to do is, and perhaps Andre, you can put on the first slide, is to talk about Scholz and Merkel first. Chancellor Merkel has been around for 16 years. There are many people in Germany of the younger generation who didn't actually know there was somebody else who could be Chancellor than Angela Merkel, who had been around since 2005. Imagine the number of American presidents or of British prime ministers that would fill these 16 years. And She's been replaced after, as I said, 16 years by Olaf Scholz. And I'll briefly say something about him because you will probably not know him quite as well as you may have known Angela Merkel. So a brief, big background about his career. He grew up in Hamburg, a city in the north of Germany, one of the largest German port. He read law. He practiced as a lawyer, specializing in employment law. But from an early stage, he embarked on a political career. First, becoming a very active member of the Young Socialists in his teenage years, where he rose to become deputy federal chair in the 1980s. So that's about 40 years ago. He's now in his early 60s. And he was quite leftist back in his early days. By the way, as was Gerhard Schröder, so they tend to rise from the lower left to the upper right in their parties, but that's a general phenomenon. Scholz became the SPD chair in the city-state of Hamburg. So Hamburg is a city, but it's also a state within the Federal Republic. And then under Chancellor Schröder in the early 2000s, he became general secretary of the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, Germany's oldest democratic party. He became a member of the Bundestag. He became Minister of Employment and Social Affairs under Chancellor Merkel then. In the late 2000s, and then left federal politics to become minister president of his home state of Hamburg, a position he held from 2011 to 2018. So he has been around the block. He's held quite a number of offices, and when he was minister president of Hamburg, he became known for his pragmatism, for his economic competence, but also for his awareness, for example, of the importance of housing policy. So he was very successful in that respect. He came back from Hamburg to the federal stage in 2018 to become Minister of Finance under Chancellor Merkel and the Vice Chancellor of the Federal Republic. He was not uncontroversial in his own party, and that can be demonstrated that in 2019, when Andrea Nahles, the then chair, the first woman to chair the Social Democratic Party and a close associate of Scholz's, was resigned, he ran for the leadership. By then it was fashionable to do it in pairs, so he did it with a colleague, Clara Geiwitz from East Germany, and he failed to become party chairman. However, the two who won and whose names you will not know, and Saskia Esken and now Henning, I need your help. What was Norbert Walter Borjans? Yeah, it says German politicians tend to have unpronounceable name. I'm sure many of you remember Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, which is even difficult to pronounce if you're German. So the two who actually succeeded in becoming joint chairs of the Social Democratic Party then in 2020 invited him to become the Chancellor candidate, and in the election in 2021, to everyone's surprise, including seasoned election watchers like myself, the SPD actually came in as the largest party, and Scholz became the federal chancellor. He has always, well, he naturally is indeed, but he has emphasized his closeness in terms of personality to Angela Merkel. I've put this picture up for you because you can see that he even jokingly imitated her famous signature diamond hand gesture to emphasize, of course, the similarity. Like Merkel, he is not very outgoing. He is a no-nonsense politician. He is not vain, at least not publicly. He is quietly self-assured. He is always on top of his brief. So that sounds all sounds very reassuringly to many Germans close to Angela Merkel. Of course, they do not share the same policy positions, although they are in both their parties, they are fairly centrist. So that perhaps as an introduction to the person who's leading Germany at the moment, and let me move on to the coalition he is heading. And Andre, can you please put on the next slide? Thank you. That's the so-called traffic light coalition, and it doesn't mean that you can decide between stop and go, but it's merely it's a three-party coalition, the first three-party coalition in German politics on the federal level, and the three colors of a traffic light are the three colors of the parties involved: red for the Social Democrats, yellow for the Free Democrats, and green for the Green Party, obviously. Coalition parties, coalition governments, as some of you may know if you've dealt with Germany, are the norm in German politics. I think it's been 65 years, and it's only happened once that there was a one-party government. Otherwise, there's always been a coalition government, so that's the norm. There are 6 parties in the Bundestag, and 4 of them have in the past been part of coalitions. So they're coalitionable, if you may say so. The two that have not been members of a federal government are the Left Party and the Alternative for Deutschland, Alternative for Germany, a right-wing populist party that entered the Bundestag in 2017. So these 4 parties, the SPD, the Social Democrats, the Christian Democrats, the Liberals and the Greens, have been joined together in 2 camps, if you may say so, since the early 1980s. So for the last 40 years, while there has been some change in the party system, it's always been 2 camps. It's been the Christian Democrats and the Liberals, the FDP, versus the Social Democrats and the Greens. And they have been alternating in government, although, as in Germany, usual alternation takes some time. So Chancellor Kohl was in office for 16 years, him as well. A CDU, Christian Democrat, Liberal government, and then Chancellor Schröder, Gerhard Schröder, Social Democrats plus Greens. And after that, there have been 3 governments. 3 of the 4 governments that Angela Merkel has led have been so-called grand coalition governments, meaning that they joined the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats. So the 2 big parties and the 2 smaller parties of the camps, the Liberals and the Greens, were left out. The traffic light coalition is special because it is the first attempt to cross that old camp boundary by including the Social Democrats and the Greens, but also the Liberals, the FDP, from the old camp with the CDU. The SPD had gone through a very rough time. Electoral defeats after Schröder lost the election in 2005. The share of the party share of the vote went down continuously. It was saved in a way by joining grand coalitions, but always as the junior partner to Angela Merkel's Christian Democrats. And there was a perception of continuing crisis in the Social Democratic Party. The Greens, who had their first without government in between 1998 and 2005, have been out of government for more than 15 years. They had a new leadership after 2017, Annalena Baerbock and Robert Habeck, 2 very prominent ministers now, and they managed to double the membership of the Green Party since 2017. So this is a party that is in substantial change and is on an electoral upswing. So they even ran their first chancellor candidate, Annalena Baerbock, but of course she didn't get it. The Liberals, the Free Democrats, have also not been in government since for the last 10 years. They had, in a way, the biggest jump to make into that new coalition, which has an ambitious program based around the catchword of reform, something they can all agree on, both of the economy but also on issues like climate policy, which are, of course, by all parties involved, and all the others except the right-wing populist AfD be considered the main challenge that German politics faces these days. I'll briefly now say something about the program that they have agreed on. And Andre, can you please put on the next slide? Yeah. First of all, to say that, as I said, German governments usually are coalitions, and over the last decades it's become the norm to set up a coalition treaty, which is being negotiated over a couple of weeks at the beginning. And this is a very substantial policy document. I've put in the figures here for you on the slides for you to see. It's 177 pages long and not 58 words, but 58,000 words. So it is really quite something. It's a very long document, and I will not go through all the details of the 7 main subject areas, but I want to briefly mention some of them. They involve things that are here on the slide. I don't need to read that to you, but I'll briefly say something about each of the points. So, modernization, digitalization of the state. The perception is generally that Germany is quite behind the curve in this respect. So modernizing and speeding up public administration is a major goal of the new government. They're opting for more transparency. They want to lower the voting age. They want to help improve digitalization both of society and of business. And have a number of other things that I'll be happy to come back to if you have questions. Second major point is climate protection in a social and ecological market economy. You may have heard about the German concept of the social market economy. It's originated from the Christian Democrats in the 1950s, very successful. This has now been amended to be the social and ecological market economy. Here the new government sees a very clear need for major transformations, from decarbonization to dealing with demographic change. The government wants to focus on the Paris climate goals and the UN sustainability goals. So you see the goals are linked into goals on the international level. And the major goal is to join economic and ecological responsibility, as they call it. One of the concrete goals they set themselves is to transform the car industry, as you know, one of the major, the major industry in Germany, and to develop Germany into the leading market for electromobility. The goal is that within 8 years, by 2030, there should be 15 million electric cars on German streets. This is quite a way to go, but it's a goal. And another climate-related goal is that ideally, as the government or the treaty puts it, Germany is to phase out the use of coal also by 2030. This is all driven by the 1.5 centigrade goal of the Paris Climate Accord that you will probably all be familiar with. Two of the three parties, the Social Democrats and the Greens, are fairly sort of socially minded in European terms, liberal in American terms. So opportunities and social protection in modern employment is an important aspect of the coalition treaty as well. Here they have pledged to keep the pension rate above 48% and the contribution rate below 20%. There are lots of experts who say this is quite a challenge given demographic change, but we'll see what comes of that. They are also going to experiment with parts of the pension fund being invested in the stock market. This is something that is a new step for the German pension system, and this is something that the Liberals, the Free Democrats, have put into the coalition treaty. There also so there's a lot of sort of social protection, especially for pensioners, who of course are a very large group of the German electorate and are the group that most reliably actually goes to vote. And so the Social Democrats, for example, have their largest share of their voters in the age group over 50. So you would expect they would be friendly to the pensioners. Another major goal is raising the minimum wage to 12 euros per hour. This was a core promise by now Chancellor Scholz in the election campaign, and this has made its way into the coalition treaty. Let me come quickly to the last 3 or 4 points. Opportunities for children, families and education. Children's rights are to go into the constitution, the basic law. An improvement of the childcare situation, where again Germany is not considered to be performing very well in international comparison, and more a sort of push for digitalization in schools. I've got school-age kids, and I've seen during the pandemic that there's a lot still to be improved as far as German schools and digitalization and digital teaching especially are concerned. Freedom and security, equality and diversity in a modern democracy. This is quite a mouthful for the next heading in the coalition treaty. This is something where both the Liberals, the Free Democrats and the Greens are very sort of concerned about privacy rights, civil liberties, and the government has undertakes it to balance freedom and security better than has been done in the past. What they want to do, which is interesting, is to put in place an expert so-called Freedom Commission that will evaluate future security legislation, and this is an interesting step, but it also is one where sort of there are brakes in a way being put on the freedom of parliament. We'll see how that works, but it's something I'll come back to towards the end. Another interesting goal is that the government has set itself the goal to reach gender equality by the end of this decade. Fortunately, they didn't define what gender equality means, so it's up to everyone themselves to define it, and I'll bet you they find an indicator which will, towards the end of the decade, say that they've fulfilled their goal. Towards the end, there is a chapter on Germany's responsibility in Europe and in the world. As usual, one might say, there is a very strong commitment to international integration, particularly, of course, to the European Union. There is a reform process going on, which doesn't get much publicity at the moment, but the government has pledged to support it. And of course, there's a very strong commitment to multilateralism. Germany has been shocked by the attempts of the previous American administration to do away with much of multilateralism and the multilateral world security order. And so there is a renewed commitment. The last point is about investment for the future, but that's something that Henning will talk more about, so I'll spare you that. To sum it up, lots of changes. You have to fill 177 pages. I would say nothing fundamental, but still substantial change. So if the government were to put all this into practice, or say even 2/3 of that, that would be quite a number of policy changes in almost all areas of policy making. This is what they planned. and lots of projects that each of the participating parties has put into the coalition treaty. Hence, they have a lot riding on keeping this coalition treaty. They will not give this up lightly. The politicians who have committed themselves to that, those who have been elected on the basis of making these pledges, even in case of fundamental change. And of course, fundamental change is the situation that we're now in. Andre, can you put on the next slide, please? Thank you. It's Zeitenwende. That's how you pronounce the German word, of course, and it's perhaps something that may enter other languages, like other famous words, like Weltanschauung or kindergarten. Perhaps you'll talk about Zeitenwende in the future as well. Who knows? The Russian invasion of Ukraine has certainly been a major shock to Germany, like to everybody else, but because this was not expected. This is a threat, as you all know, to the European peace and security order that has been fundamentally based on the inviolability of borders, of national borders. This has been going back to the CSCE process and the Helsinki Declaration of 1975. So that's quite a major change over a very long time. But also more recently, there have been the Paris Charter of 1990, which ended the Cold War. There's been the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997. So a lot of things where we all expected that this would be stable. And there is a general danger of the liberal international security order established after the end of the Second World War. Germany has had for a long time particularly close relations. You will all remember perhaps another German word, Ostpolitik, mainly linked to former Chancellor Willy Brandt in the 1970s. Which is always often being credited as paving the way towards German unification. And there have been very close economic, or relatively close economic and particularly energy links. Russia is not a major economic partner for Germany in terms of Germany as a trading nation. You know, Germany is one of the biggest exporters in the world, and the Russian economy is small by international comparison. But in terms of energy, Russia has indeed been a major partner, and that this will now change has been the subject of a major speech that Chancellor Scholz delivered on the 27th of February, and where he used the word Zeitenwende, a turning point of the ages, no less than 5 times within that speech. So this is the Zeitenwende speech. The things that have received most attention is his pledge to substantially change the funding for the armed forces in Germany, particularly by setting up a 100 billion euro special fund for the Bundeswehr, and to also in the future increase the annual defense budget above the NATO target of 2% of GDP. In the past, Germany's contribution to the annual defense budget has been around 1.2, 1.4% of GDP, so substantially below the 2%, which means that if you want to raise it now to, no, not yet. Can you go back, please, Andre? Yep, thanks. So if you're at 1.4% and you want to raise it to 2%, that means it's a 50% increase of spending. This is substantial. And this, of course, has made the headlines, and there's been a lot of talk about that. There are also problems, and I want to briefly address them by saying that money isn't everything. Money is one thing, but money isn't everything. And there are, for example, substantial problems with procurement in the German army, which has been a long time it's been discussed. It's been public knowledge. There have been problems. This has to do in part with very tight control that the Bundestag, the federal parliament, and in particular the budgetary committee exert on all defense spending. Due to German history, the Bundeswehr has always been considered a parliamentary army. So it's the parliament that usually has a very close connection to the armed forces, and also very tightly controls all spending. So, for example, any spending above 25 million, which isn't really very much, has to be explicitly okayed by the budgetary committee of the Bundestag. So this doesn't make for for a proclivity for large and big spending. There's also been problems with public discourse. There have been attempts over the last decade and a half, perhaps, at creating more interest in strategic matters. Former federal President Gauck, for example, with then Foreign Minister Steinmeier, for example, made repeated attempts to come back to increase public interest in strategic discussions, and also an awareness that Germany has to contribute more. This hasn't found much resonance with the German public, one has to say. And partly as a result of that, or these are two coins in a way of the same coin, two sides of the same coin, problems with political support also are visible in terms of the Zeitenwende and the special fund. Security policy is not a very popular field for MPs, for German MPs. It's not something that gets you promoted, and particularly not if you're in the Social Democratic Party. And the Greens are also not necessarily known for being very fond of arms. In fact, the Green Party owes one of its roots is in the old peace movement. So high-profile security specialists have, for example, left the Social Democratic Party over recent years. They have a floor leader who has very strong pacifist leanings. So this all doesn't make it much easier for Chancellor Scholz to get the detailed work of his plans through Parliament. He has talked the talk, but it will not be easy to walk the walk. And another point that needs to be mentioned here is that many politicians of the boomer generation came politically of age during the dispute about the NATO double-track decision. This was in the early 1980s. People like Chancellor Scholz himself were at the peace movement rallies, huge rallies back then in the then federal capital of Bonn. They're strongly influenced, or were strongly influenced by the peace movement. And of course, the German unification seemed to prove that there was indeed, in the famous words of Francis Fukuyama, the end of history, or at least the end of armed conflict. In Germany, there is it's a very popular view to say that there is no military solution to any conflict. We see that this is wrong at the moment, but it's very difficult for many to actually change their point of view in that respect. And the last point I want to make there is that Germany always had a conscription army. Back in the days of the Bonn Republic in the 1980s, it had as many as 500,000 people under arms. It's now down to 150,000. And in 2011, so a bit more than a decade ago, under the Merkel government, conscription was ended. There was a focus. The assumption was that in the future, deployment would mostly be to conflicts abroad, things like Afghanistan, and you would need more professional soldiers, and you couldn't do that with a conscription army. This is something that I just want to add to say that why things have been moving in one direction and why it will be difficult or not easy to change course now. One thing that I would add towards the end is that, in part, the changed security situation has strengthened the energy transformation. Even people like the Liberal Party chair and finance minister Lindner now speak of air turbines as freedom energy. So this is a paradoxical effect that just needs to be noted. Now, Andre, please, for the next slide. A brief point about support for Chancellor Scholz and his aforementioned speech. It is quite clear that, as one would expect, after the war started, there was a certain rallying around the flag effect. Support for Scholz rose. It should also be said that more recent polls, now that he hasn't really followed through with very sort of clear leadership, have seen that dented a little bit. But it's volatile, and in general, he had a lot of support initially. It's his to lose, and at the moment he seems to be on track for that. The second opinion poll I've added here is just to say that support for measures against Russia, even if prices go up or shortages in energy provision result from that, or disadvantages occur for German businesses, are widely accepted. This is typical. The numbers I've shown you here. It's up from 90% from almost 90% for the Greens, but throughout all parties, with even the Linke having a clear majority. The only party whose supporters are not prepared to do that is the right-wing populist Alternative for Germany, who have great admiration for Vladimir Putin, and are in a bit of a pickle at the moment because, of course, he isn't very popular in Germany. With that, I thank you for the moment. I'll hand over to Henning and come back to you for a final slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Henning.
Thank you very much, and also hello to everybody from my side. We agreed at the beginning that we're going to leave the question about the possible energy embargo and these sort of things to the discussion, but so therefore I will just focus on a few points about a fiscal policy, if I may. Also, I mean, maybe a first remark on macroeconomic situation. It's as volatile as it can be. It's everybody can look up the current projections on GDP growth and so on and so forth. I would say it's anybody's guess at the moment. So nothing what we see at the moment is very reliable. So in that sense, I think it's better for me to provide you with a bit of a background on the fiscal policy discussion, and where I think we're going to have bottlenecks going forward, which gels very well with what Andreas has just said, and where I think we would not have bottlenecks. But first of all, the fiscal situation when the new government took office, and I just spent 2 years in the federal finance ministry, just finished my term as its first fellow a month ago. The discussion has always very much been about sort of fiscal constraints to investment, right? So the discussion about, how can this energy transition and digitization and so on and so forth, how can this be financed as long as there is a constitutional debt brake that is not going to be changed, because simply even the new coalition doesn't have a majority in both chambers, and the Conservative Party is not going along with changing the constitution in order to modify the debt brake. So this has been in the German fiscal policy discussion basically at the heart of the debate ever since really the European debt crisis of almost 10 years ago. Fiscal austerity, being prudent in Germany, and so on and so forth. So how with that kind of fiscal policy inheritance, how can you actually put that investment into practice? Well, I would argue that even though the constitutional debt brake, for the reasons that I mentioned, will not be changed in this parliament, there are enough ways of circumventing it that, in my estimation, finance will not be a limiting factor either for the Bundeswehr, the German army, nor for the transformation agenda in this current parliament. Why? Well, basically, there are three ways of free tools that you can use in order to improve the fiscal capacity. The first one is that the debt brake has had an exemption in this financial year and in the last financial year. And the money that was approved by Parliament was not fully spent on the corona measures. So we had a very large framework of debt that was approved by Parliament, but the situation was not luckily as dire as was predicted. So that gave the leeway to put some money away, stash some money away for the transformation. And I think at the end of 21, Christian Lindner, the finance minister, new finance minister, put about 60 billion worth of investment into a transformation fund. The argument here was, you know, what is the link with COVID? The argument was that because of COVID, all this money had to be spent on COVID measures, whereas investment was put on hold. So basically putting that investment into place after the pandemic is linked to the pandemic in that sense. So that will probably be challenged in the Constitutional Court, but that was the sort of economic or the logical link, how that money that was approved for COVID measures was actually transferred into a fund that will be spent on investment in transformation. There's also off-balance sheet vehicles that has been known in many countries beyond Germany for a long time. So you can use public companies such as the German railway company, Deutsche Bahn, and you can put actually some debt on these vehicles, for instance, for railway tracks and so on and so forth. So there's no particular need to finance that out of the federal budget. So you can use public companies to assume some of these debts, which frees up fiscal space in the core budget. And there's also very aggressive promotion of private investments by using the German public investment bank, the KfW, to set all sorts of incentive programs, and in particular in the construction sector to build environmentally friendly housing. And second, they identified roughly 30 billion worth of climate unfriendly subsidies that they wanted to cut, which at the same time then would open up the space to reinvest it. If you can put that in the next slide, please. That's right. So, and last but not least, there are also some technical measures. You know, the German debt brake has some cyclical element to it in the way it is being designed, which is related to the so-called output gap, which is, as the economists amongst you will know, a very sort of hypothetical thing to calculate. And there's also the idea in the coalition treaty to change the way in which that kind of cyclical measure is being calculated, which could free up to 30 billion as well. So there's an overview. I put the link on that slide. There's a general overview over all these different elements that would basically help to circumvent the limitations of the constitutional debt brake. And in the estimation of the authors of that article, they add up to at least 176 billion of additional financial leeway. And this doesn't include the incentives for private investment. So that's why I would say, and obviously the 100 billion Sondervermögen for the Bundeswehr goes on top of that. So that's why I would say that in this current parliament, finance or fiscal policy is not going to be a limiting factor either for for making progress in terms of putting the Bundeswehr into better shape or actually making headway in the transition agenda. Next slide, please. So if it's not the fiscal policy constraint, what is actually the limiting factor? Well, I would say, and Andreas has already alluded to this, that public administration is the most limiting factor in this parliament. And well, I can give you a host of examples. Let me just put a few to you. Andreas already mentioned that the parliamentary committee has to approve every sort of investment in the Bundeswehr, every procurement above 25 million. I mean, already the budget for the Bundeswehr was 52 billion, right? So that puts it in perspective how small a percentage of the overall budget that already is. And of course, once it is in parliament, there are also political influences that become part of the procurement process. So that might mean that you not always get the best value for money. So some of the discussion in Germany was, for instance, that even though we spend only about 1.3, 1.4% of GDP in relative terms on defense, in absolute terms, we spend, well, I think the last figure was about 50 billion, pretty much on par with the French. So, but how come that the French have more soldiers, a nuclear capacity, and an aircraft carrier for roughly the same amount of money that they spend on their army, right? So there is an issue in this regard. Also, public administration. I mean, if you go into these federal ministries, they're basically still run like Prussian institutions, right? So very hierarchical. The processes are very much incremental in the way that you coordinate within a ministry, you coordinate between ministries, and this is good if the challenge is incremental change, making things a little bit better. But in terms of crisis, as we found in the Corona crisis, where acting speedily is at a premium, that kind of structure really runs against the limits very quickly. There's also just planning procedures and these sort of things. I mean, I live just on the outside of Berlin, and there has been the first Tesla factory, the Gigafactory, that's been opened in Europe, well, that was basically portrayed as a very good example how quickly things can go, right? So that was built and ready to produce cars within, I think, 1.5 or 2 years. But the honest story to this is that they basically started to build the factory on preliminary permissions. So only recently they got the final permission to actually build the factory that was already in operation by then. So that was helped by a very proactive state government that wanted to make sure that this, Tesla is coming to Brandenburg. But there was a lot of political ambition behind this as well. A similar story is now unfolding with the question about the LNG terminals, the floating LNG terminals, 2 of which ought to be built in the German North Sea area. Again, here speed is at a premium given the situation with Russia, and it is not that unlikely that there will be some sort of provision, similar to the Tesla case, with which the companies that are building or are supposed to build these LNG terminals will be given some sort of guarantee to take away their business risk to get going as quickly as possible, even though there might not be full planning permission has not been obtained yet. Maybe the last example before I leave it at this is in the last government, actually, Germany wanted to improve the way sort of innovations are being marketized or being put into businesses, and created 2 agencies that jointly also perform a similar function to DARPA in the United States. So we have a civil one and we have a military one. And the civil one, called Sprint, lacks from 2 fundamental factors. I mean, it's a government institution, but it's a quango, right? It's outside of the federal government, but it's a wholly federal government-owned company. But here, still a lot of the public rules apply. So if your mission is to find Sprunginnovationen, so basically fundamental innovation, and try to foster business models out of that kind of innovation, well, first of all, you're competing for the best brains in the market. So you're competing against the likes of Google, Apple, Tesla, and so on and so forth. And if you then have to abide by the payments, by the salary schedule of the federal government, and that puts you at a disadvantage immediately. So if you just are allowed to pay public servant salaries, you simply wouldn't get the people you need in order to fulfill that functions. And the second obstacle, the director of that agency has been very outspoken in the German press, has been that the Federal Audit Office doesn't like the idea of risk capital. So it doesn't like the idea that some of the investments that you make as a public agency will most likely be sunk, whereas others will pay off. So, but that is pretty alien to the idea of a Federal Audit Office accepting sunk investment. So that is the kind of structural problem that I think we have been dealing with, or we are dealing with, on many different levels, and that, to my mind, is the most limiting factor in the energy transition, as well as in terms of how to improve the situation of the Bundeswehr and so on and so forth. And it's actually also part of the coalition agreement that the public service, public administration reform ought to be thought through. But my estimation would be that this is something that will have to be looked at in much more detail. And as I said, my general thesis is, as opposed to what we've been discussing over recent years, I don't think the money is the problem. I do think the structure is the problem, and we have to deal with the structure if we want to solve the overall problem. So I keep it at that for the time being, and as I said, we can discuss the energy embargo question in the discussion. Thank you.
Okay.
Andreas?
Yeah, I'll do a very brief wrap up, and which rhymes very well with what Henning just said. Just to say that to explain why what we're talking about is not something that is particular to this government or even the last 20 years of government, but it's something that has been a part of the Federal Republic and has actually for a long time been seen as a very positive part of it. And of course, it can be linked back to German historical experiences. The Federal Republic is a state that prioritizes stability, that favors stability, and therefore substantial policy change is very difficult here. This is something that has actually first been researched by a German-American political scientist, Peter Katzenstein of Cornell University, who wrote a famous book terming Germany the semi-sovereign state and indicating how difficult it was for it to change course. There is a diffusion of power which has to do with the federal system, which is different, say, from the American federal system. The German federalism, the two layers of government actually have to cooperate, and since they often are being governed by different parties, that makes it very difficult. I mentioned coalition government, which is the rule. I also mentioned strong sort of contre-gouvernements like the Federal Constitutional Court or formerly the Bundesbank, now the European Central Bank. So all this favors incremental change and makes rapid policy change difficult and unlikely, even if, like at the moment, you would basically give an arm and a leg for having the ability to change policy very rapidly. So political will and skill, of course, must not be discounted, but I would just say if they don't manage to overcome all these hurdles, this will be the reasons to look out for. Thank you very much for your attention, and we both look forward to your questions now.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to stop sharing the screen now. So I wonder if perhaps, Scott, if you have a question first.
Thank you, first of all, for a really, really interesting presentation. I was just hoping you might tie some of these themes in with the EU, currently headed, of course, by a former German defense secretary, and how you see the Scholz government under the pressure of the invasion of Ukraine, positioning or repositioning itself with a greatly expanded defense budget vis-a-vis the EU, whether in terms of common defense policy or the other major players within the EU, and in particular France. Thank you.
Andreas, do you want to start with that? You're on mute. There you are.
There's something wrong with my stream deck. I don't know why. I think actually I would like to leave that to Henning. Henning, you're closer to the political machine at the moment, and I think you might have more input on that. I'd be very happy to answer the question in the chat.
Okay, Henning, do you want to answer the question that Scott has just asked?
Yeah, okay. Well, let me make a few comments there, and I'll do the talking head thing. I asked the question I wish to be asked, right? So rather than the answer to the question that you were actually asked. But I think in general terms, the German policy has really been, and you can still see that to a large extent, about paying for defense rather than actually implementing or doing defense, right? And you can see that from the policy at the moment as well, right? So very reluctant in order to deliver hardware, but very happy to pay for others to deliver hardware, right? So and I think the transition, these 100 billion the kind of direction that has been sketched out is very clearly that this is meant to be very closely integrated into the capacity of the European Union as well as NATO, right? So the first idea to buy these, I think it's the F-35 bombers from the United States, is about compatibility rather than, you know, doing your own research project and building your own weapons and so on and so forth. There will be some element of that probably as well, but I think that the general direction here is that of compatibility, and maybe then linked to that the question about that has been really the elephant in the room in Germany about the energy embargo. You know, what is the policy towards Russia? Well, there has been a big discussion here about, you know, how much damage a sudden stop of energy supplies would actually cause. And the economic modeling was between 3 to 6% GDP, probably 10% GDP over the period of 2 years, where you would need to substitute that. And there was always the discussion was always like, you know, we had lockdowns and we assumed these economic costs during COVID times. So we should do the same here. We can manage, and that is the right thing to do. Well, the reason why the German government has not implemented that is that this kind of energy embargo is very unlikely to end the war in any meaningful way in the next 3 months. Why is that? If the estimation is that the whole of the European Union, not just Germany, pays about 1 billion euros or $1 billion a day in terms of money to Russia, there are at least 3 elements that would basically put Russia in a position to still operate. First of all, we only froze about 2/3 of its central bank reserves, right? So there's still 1/3 of about more than $200 billion available to Putin, because it's either in Russia in terms of in the form of gold, or it's in China. So it's not that he's going to run out of foreign exchange in anytime soon, even though, you know, even if he stopped the energy tomorrow. The second point is that obviously the point has been made several times that he pays in ruble. He can obviously print ruble, and the hardware is already there. There will be inflationary, of course, but the question is, you know, how much additional inflation will that create in what kind of time period? And what would that mean politically? Would that mean that actually the political support for his government would be undermined, or would it be the opposite? That he says this is Western aggression towards us, and it's basically closing the ranks behind him. And the third element that I see very little talk about actually in the public discussion is, especially when it comes to gas, it is assumed that there's a very low elasticity of replacement for customers, right? Because there are no pipelines to China or India or anything like that, and you cannot use these ships very quickly in order to ship to India or China. That's why he has no other option other than, you know, delivering to us. Well, he could of course use oil and gas futures to circumvent that, right? So if you look at the spot prices at the moment, they're really high. If you offer a very high discount on that for, you know, energy delivery to India and China to be delivered in 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, they will have a very high energy demand going forward into these years. For payments today, there's of course there are tools like these kind of financial derivatives that can be used to actually generate inflows, cash inflows now for delivery of raw material in the future. So and the problem here is that my argument has always been, if 5 or 6% GDP loss in Germany would end the war, we should do it tomorrow. It's an absolute no-brainer if that really would stop the mass murder. But the problem is that if you suffer the costs of that embargo without seeing the benefits, i.e. an end to the war, and the killing of civilians and anything else would go on for another 6 months or so. And bear in mind, you know that better than I do, but if you look at the intelligence of the security analysts, they seem to say that they cannot sustain that type of war he's currently leading anyway beyond another few months. So the financial situation would probably not be the limiting factor here, but the actual physical condition of the army would probably more likely be the limiting factor. The problem is that if the costs materialize but the benefits are not there, the support for the government, for the hardline would erode, and then probably the joint action of the West would erode. That's, I think, the problem in this discussion. And if you look beyond the headlines, that's what most governments do. The British government hasn't phased out gas imports now. Greg Hansen said, to do this as quickly as possible. And the current schedule in Germany is independence from Russian oil by the end of the year and independence from Russian gas by 2024, if at all possible, bringing this forward into 2023. So maybe that's the link to what the current policy is in terms of energy dependence on Russia, and how this is sort of linking maybe into the European response as well.
Andreas, do you have any?
Yeah, no, nothing to add to that, but I'd be happy to answer the two questions around energy in the chat. So the first about whether the coalition agreement says anything about energy security, and that is a very easy one. No, it doesn't. The focus in the coalition treaty is fully on moving to renewables and to hydrogen. You know that Germany has decided to end both nuclear energy. The last 3 reactors will be decommissioned by the end of this year, and also to end coal. So gas was seen as a temporary measure, and energy security does not feature at all. Much more of the focus is to portray or emphasize the importance of making these changes because of the climate situation, but also how to achieve social balancing, bolstering in a way of the costs that are implied in that transformation. So that's where you find several paragraphs on in the coalition treaty. You won't find anything on that. There's quite a bit on Russia in it, and there's a lot that is very critical, particularly regarding interference in Belarus and Ukraine, which of course at that point was quite on a different level. And there is a lot about human rights in Russia, but there is also a lot about close relationships, beneficial effects of trade, and having a partnership with Russia on the hydrogen transformation. So that's what is in the treaty. And the second question was whether Germany would consider recommissioning its nuclear energy, given the energy gap that is at the moment, or that threatens to come into existence should the gas flow stop. And the simple answer to that is no. And it has both technical, business, and political reasons. The technical reasons is that everything has been sort of decommissioning. This is a very long process, which actually has taken several years. There is no nuclear fuel to sort of turn that around very quickly. All the firms who actually run these, there are actually only 3, and they're minor reactors, are unwilling to extend their period of use unless the government would force them, in which case they would insist on the government taking on all the potential risk, and that for the government would be extremely unattractive. It would also probably have to go through lots of security checks, because the last security checks, I think, of these reactors have been something like 12 or 13 years ago, because they were running out anyway. So, and the last point is, of course, is political. There's been a widespread consensus, which one of the famous U-turns of Chancellor Merkel after Fukushima was that she had reversed the decision to exit from nuclear that the red-green government under Chancellor Schröder had taken. After Fukushima, Chancellor Merkel, within 6 weeks, without basically consulting anybody, decided that that had been a very bad idea, and that they would now, for good, say goodbye to nuclear energy. So there's a widespread consensus, and of course it is strongest, it is in a way in the DNA, literally, of the Green Party. The Green Party has several roots. The women's movement, the peace movement, but particularly the anti-nuclear movement in the 1970s. So that would be extremely difficult for them to do.
Okay, I'll ask one brief question and then I think we'll have to stop. In terms of foreign policy, excluding Russia and also excluding current issues regarding it, have things changed with the new government? And are we likely to see any major change in foreign policy and trade policy?
In terms of foreign policy, I'm quite sure that Foreign Minister Baerbock of the Green Party already, basically since she came onto the scene and in a way in resonance with much of what her party stands for, has been far more critical of Russia and of China than the Social Democrats have been before that. There is substantial skepticism. Perhaps at the moment there is perhaps too much criticism or a too one-sided portrayal of what the Social Democrats in their foreign policy actually were aiming at. It's true that some of them may actually have become Putin's best friends, like Gerhard Schröder, but many of them actually had very responsible and the attempt at least to run far-sighted foreign policies. And I think that's something that needs to be kept in mind now as well. If you think about the economic profile of Russia, what is Russia exporting that the world wants to buy? There is very little beyond energy. And who will trust Russia selling energy in the future? Russia will, and I think that will be a major effect of the Ukraine war, Russia will find it very difficult to find any takers for its goods on the international market, at least in terms of the volume that it sells at the moment. And what will that mean in terms of the Russian population and where it wants to live? There are problems here that are facing Europe mainly, perhaps other neighboring countries as well. But I think it would be good if the Europeans started to think about that as well. How do we want to deal with Russia in 10, 15, 20 years' time?
Yeah, maybe
final comment.
Yeah, maybe an additional comment. I mean, a very ambitious part of the coalition treaty is actually a bit about Europe, where they are actually supportive of treaty change and a European superstate, and in some shape or form. I mean, in many respects, this has been superseded by current events. But having worked with Olaf Scholz when he was finance minister, he's got very pro-European instincts. For instance, his European Recovery Fund, that was a German-French idea that was put into place, to ensure that there is a pan-European recovery from the COVID predicament. So his instincts are very much pro-European, maybe more so than Angela Merkel's instincts were in her time in office, where she's often been criticized as sort of being very rational also towards the European idea, whereas it is a gut instinct element as well for many other politicians who, as the accusation went, also came from the West. But maybe last comment on the way in which the debate, how to deal with that situation goes. Maybe the reason why so many people in Germany are publicly in favor of that embargo, but against the weapons delivery, which actually inverts the need, because the weapons delivery has the short-term impact on the warfare. Whereas, as I mentioned, the energy embargo, if anything, will prevent months 9 to 15 and to prevent the next invasion rather than the current one. It is the idea that, if we bear the costs, we've done what we usually do, we've done our bit in that sense, and don't go into the territory where we feel really uncomfortable, which would be delivering weapons, which will be seen in some way of getting involved as a party of war in this conflict. I think this is where we are currently seeing the discussion, and that's why it's all kind of circumvention that I mean, I think it's a valid argument to say that, you know, the tanks that the Ukrainians already know how to operate are the most useful for them now. So where are these tanks in former Eastern Bloc countries? You know, get them to Ukraine, we're going to replace them. So, but that has the additional benefit of, you know, not having sent a tank physically from Germany to Ukraine, right? So that, and also, you know, if the Dutch go and deliver artillery and we deliver the ammunition, but again, it would be the ammunition, but not the actual hardware. I think that this discussion might very well change again, because, you know, if the UK, the US, the Australians, the Dutch, all of them are delivering weapons, it is not a position that is rational to say we are escalating the war if we deliver that kind of hardware, because so many other countries are already doing it. So you would just fall in line with what your allies are already doing. But I would guess that the government, because of that position from where we come from, would be most happy to do these two things, you know, supply everything that they can, and also provide actually a paid-for shopping list to Ukraine to buy you should buy from the German armament industry rather than Germany delivering the arms that belong to the Bundeswehr, right, to Ukraine. So these are the things that I think the reports yesterday were a bit unfair to Scholz, to be honest. So he's not saying no heavy weapons, but it's like, okay, they deliver the heavy weapons and we have to replace them, and they deliver the heavy weapons and we provide the ammunition. So it steps towards that in that direction. But I think people have to recognize that this is sort of logically a very, very steep, a very long step for Germany to take. And given that Andreas mentioned it, Zeitenwende speech, that's only a few months old, right? So we've been changing. The security and foreign policy of Germany has changed more in the last 2 months than it has in 30 years. So, and that scares a lot of people as well.